So welcome everyone. We're going to be having a bit of a discussion today in this webinar about going from complexity to clarity and what evolving technology enables us in terms of doing things better when we go to transformation programs. And that's the topic of discussion today. So in principle, I was going to do this again together with Graham, but Graham mentioned earlier he just had a big go live in the large engagement that he has had, and they are basically tackling a few things. So he may or may not join in the next, 10, 15 minutes. So let's see. But in his absence, I will be taking care of the presentation and hopefully give you the answers that you seek if there's any type of discussion that's happening. So who am I? As you can read clearly, I'm Christophe Dardijn. I've been in technology for about 30 years, I built a few companies over time, and I have been in the SAP ecosystem for over 15 years, mainly in Southeast Asia. And I exited that one in 2023, and I joined Icon Consulting Group to do, again, the setup of a services organization, and still SAP-centric, but then with all the learnings that I had over the last 15, 20 years or something like that. So who is Icon? So Icon Consulting Group, historically, we are a technology staffing company. Now, in the last 2 years, we have added an SAP service line to that, which basically focuses on SAP managed services, DevOps, customer communication management, and in specific, and it's not mentioned here, we have a strong focus on S/4HANA public cloud. And in that context, there is a lot to be said about how you're going to go through a transformation. How do you go from an old ERP system, in many cases SAP ECC, how do you go from there to a new environment with new architecture and so forth. So this year, we're going to be about 50 million in revenue, and we have an offshore delivery center in Vietnam and teams scattered around the region with big footprint in Japan and in Australia. Okay. So then, first, I wanted to put us on the same page on why do companies transform. Now, typically, you want to make sure that you can accelerate your growth, and that's kind of an internal activity. You need to make sure you can be ready for what happens in the market because your competitors act, customer behavior or consumer behavior changes. So you need to make sure that you can react to these things, and that is also a reason for transformation. And in terms of technology, there is a big push on everything AI related today. I mean, God knows how long we will still say AI because people are getting tired of this a little bit. But AI is really impactful right now, and everyone is playing with how this can influence their business and their operations and how they can become more competitive, or they want to avoid getting behind on what their competitors are doing. In 2025, companies will invest about 5.26 trillion in digital transformation, and this is US dollar value. So it's big amounts that companies are spending. And then the question is, how effective is all of that, what we actually do? So where or how impactful is this 5.26 trillion in terms of what we actually achieve? So most projects, or a good half of the projects, are not completed on time. Most of them, or the majority, exceed budgets. Many of them actually don't make the right choices in terms of technology. So if 40% of the technology choices are wrong, that means that these projects need to be redone, deliver subpar outcomes, and so forth. Now, agility, the larger your organization is, the more this becomes a challenge, which means transformation programs need to be able to cater to changing demands of the business, internal operations of the market, and that is typically a dimension which is very difficult to tackle. Now, of course, I already mentioned AI is the buzzword of the year, which means AI will impact transformation. And I see this, for instance, also in our own business and the IT consulting business. Our business is very heavily being influenced by what's happening on the AI front. And I think consultants will need to start changing their behavior, or should already have changed their behavior to a certain extent, to cater to the new capabilities that we have through AI and to make sure that we deliver more value and that we remain competitive in the market. Now, that said, only 35% of business transformations in companies have an AI governance policy. I think how we govern this and how we deal with it is definitely something that needs to be looked at. But because we have all these different priorities, like you saw earlier in the in the poll because of all these different priorities. This governance piece, it's always a difficult thing to tackle. Governance compliance, which means it kind of trails behind what the things are that are possible in the market. Now, when we do these transformations, now what we hope for is simple things. We want to have a clear overview, clear directions. This application supports that. This is the way that the particular process is done. That's how my customers interact with me and so forth. So we want to make sure that we have this clear, crystal clear and visibility. Now, in reality, we typically deal with things like this. You have a scattering of systems and people and departments and relationships and historical technologies and so forth. So most of us face pretty complex landscapes that, even while we are looking at them, continue to evolve. So it's typically a big challenge to create that transparency and to create visibility on what we are doing. And this is not just the case for the application landscape, but it's also the case for the processes that we use to execute our business operations. So systems and process typically both suffer from this complexity syndrome. And when we look into the details, even if on the high level something is typically or understandable, the moment that you go into the weeds, it becomes very, very complex very often. Now, I've had an example of an insurance company a couple of years ago who did a project for 8 countries in one go because they had the same business lines across the region. And everything was good until they descended to the operational level within every country, and then the whole project fell apart. So they spent 2.5 years thinking on how to manage this, and eventually it broke down in 8 different projects to make sure that they could cater to the needs of every individual organization. So the devil is always in the detail, which gives us a lot of challenges. Second dimension, which we typically have that doesn't help us in terms of understanding what is happening in an organization, is you have the business that evolves, but we also have people that move. And we often see or we have this ambition to make sure that we have complete documentation and what have you. But most of the time, the best information you get out of the people who run the process. And documentation lags, is not updated. And as a consequence, you cannot always rely on these artifacts to make sure that you get the right information to understand how things really work, or to see how things are really interconnected and which role they play in an organization. So bottom line, there's a bunch of things that we really know, and that's actually relatively small. And then we have a visibility on the things that we don't know. But then beyond that, there is a much broader field of things that we really are not aware of. So we don't even know that we are not aware of these things. So how do we kind of get ourselves in a position to get a better start in a transformation program? Is by gaining insights. Now, of course, we all want this. We all talk about this. Now, how can you go about this in today's world, where we actually have much more capabilities and means to do this than we used to have 5 years or 10 years ago? So everyone is always talking about digital transformation. And I think with what is now available in the market, we can do things a little bit different and a lot more fact-based than in the past. So we should, the moment that we start with a program like this, first do an assessment where we use fact-based insights. Now, fact-based insights is not just talking to people, it's basically really looking at how do my operations truly run. And what I then again see in quite a few organizations when they talk about doing an ERP upgrade or a migration from ECC to S/4HANA, very often organizations end up looking only at what happens in their ERP. And that is probably a little bit limited. And that's where an assessment comes in, where you talk about a higher level and you look at things from a process perspective in the organization. So you understand where the technology that you have fits into the business processes and how your organization is best served by the solutions that you use. ERP is a very big and important part of that, but there is also a lot of satellite systems. Now, the way that you then typically can go about this, you have on the one hand fact and you have opinion-based insights. And if you can combine these, then you will probably end up with a much better view of reality. It's never going to be perfect, but you can reach a much better level of understanding when you use different tools. So on the one hand, you use, for instance, the tools that you see here, Signavio and LeanIX, and I'll come back to that in a minute in a bit more detail. And tools like Signavio and LeanIX actually can help you with the fact side of the house. So they will basically use the information that is available in your systems or in your architecture or in your landscape to build up a fact-based overview of, in the case of Signavio, how your processes run. In the case of LeanIX, what are the applications in your landscape? What is the purpose they serve, and so forth. So you first get this overview based on real live data on things that are being used in your organization. Now, a second part, which is no less important, is making sure that you have an understanding of the perception of user. And this is what I then call the opinion-based insights. I mean, you can have the best possible view on how your real business process runs in your SAP, but that doesn't necessarily mean that people are happy, that people feel that it's efficient, and so forth. So the moment that you use structured questionnaires that go through the different parts of the business process, you can collect this information, and you can use this information to prepare a number of discussions or workshops with key stakeholders where you can do a deep dive in areas of concern, whatever that they may be. And in some cases, in accounts payable, people may have certain type of issues that they recurringly run into. And even from a business process perspective or an ERP perspective, the process looks all right, but then operationally, people still face issues. So that's why the human dimension or the opinion-based insights are then important. And that's what I mentioned here. You have a few deep dive sessions with key stakeholders, you get the overarching understanding, and then for specific cases that you have identified, you can go into deep discussions around whatever the problem may be. It can be a piece of technology, it can be an inefficient process, it can be how you engage your customers, and what have you. So talking about the technology side to get the fact-based insights, and this is where most of the new developments have happened over the last, 4 or 5 years, where SAP has brought together a set of solutions which they use or they propose to use to create these fact-based insights. And I mean, there are other tools out there in the market, but if you look at the ones that are presented here, some of the advantages here are that SAP has heavily invested to make sure that they are directly integrated into the SAP stack, which means that it's quicker and easier to adopt these tools and get relevant data and analysis out of them than it will be if you use third-party tools, however powerful they may be. Now, if a company is not based on the SAP stack, so you don't have SAP ERP or ECC or S4HANA as a core finance system or as a core ERP system, then that advantage, of course, will be less obvious because those integration advantages are not there. But this is basically the tool set that SAP proposes and that I have seen in practice work to provide deep insights in the fact-based side of how do I run my business and what does my application landscape look like. Now, for the discussion today, I'm not going to be talking about WalkMe. WalkMe is a user enablement tool to help accelerate user adoption and stuff like that. So call it contextual help. For me, not related to the fact-based insights in terms of an analysis, even though the outcome of an analysis can be used to help user adoption and so forth through WalkMe. Now, the two pieces that are actually really relevant, if you look at on the left-hand side, you have SAP Signavio. Now, SAP Signavio is basically, it started off with a process mining tool, which basically creates insights on the basis of your system data. And within the context of SAP, your system can be your SAP core system, ECC, it can be your MES, can be planning tools and so forth. Now, SAP Signavio comes with standard integration with ECC and S4, which means it already understands the data models that are being used in those systems. And as a consequence, it can very easily visualize how your business processes really happen on a day-to-day basis. So the moment that you have a procurement process and you send out a purchase order, you receive your goods, you have your goods receipt, then an invoice that you receive, and so forth and so forth. So there may be multiple steps. In some cases, you will have a purchase requisition, then a purchase order, and what have you. And depending on your ideal process, the expectation would be that in my company, we run 99% in the same way. But in reality, it's never like that. And with Signavio, you can create the visibility on these big standard processes, which every single company has, on how much do they behave in a certain pattern. So you will see the multiple different process variant flows. And based on that, you can compare with industry best practices. And Signavio, through the process intelligence, will also come up with some areas where you have the biggest potential gains, where they see the time between certain process steps will take a long time, or there are some inefficiencies in routing of particular process steps and what have you. So with Signavio, you can really create a very good basis for further discussions because it gives you fact-based insight. And that's one of the things that is really differentiating compared to the way we used to do things before, because in the past, we would only work on the basis of a human that would rebuild a business process based on interaction with users. And those things are always very heavily influenced by the opinion of people. And at this stage, it's not ideal to have that because that becomes opinion rather than fact. And if you can start off with a fact and you can say, this is how your business process typically runs, then you can have a more meaningful conversation because people can add, yes, this is the different variants. These are the ones that we feel are most ideal. And then you can dig into the detail on why do the other ones run in the way that they do? And is it actually really a problem that they run in this other way? So fact-based Signavio will give you the process insights across everything that happens in your ERP or even in satellite systems. Now, if a system is a non-SAP satellite system, you can still link it up, but you will need to do some data mapping because Signavio has a good understanding of the data structures in a lot of SAP products, but it doesn't necessarily have an understanding of the data structures in Microsoft Dynamics or something like that. So if you want to use Signavio for non-SAP tools, can be done, but then there is labeling to be done. So you can create an understanding in the system of what a particular step in a database table means. And then again, the visualization of the processes can be done and so forth. Now, on the right-hand side, you have a tool that then works outside of the SAP application, which basically does an inventory of your entire application landscape in your organization. So it will basically create an architectural picture of various systems that you have in your organization, which you can then link to where they're being used in different process steps and so forth. Now, both tools are increasingly integrated. Signavio integrates also with a number of other tools that later on during a project phase, you can go and have a look at, like test automation, planning, and what have you. Less relevant for the discussion that we have today, but quite capable in terms of putting into a bigger ecosystem where you really want to create visibility and you want to focus on supporting a process change when you go and prepare for a migration. So we want to optimize, obviously, clarity, speed, measurable value. I mean, business case, I've had these discussions with quite a few customers. The business case for an upgrade from ECC to S4, typically difficult to do. But if you work fact-based, you get these insights, you can actually identify optimization opportunities and drive real conversations, which means you have clarity, you will have measurable value, and speed. It becomes a bit a question of where is the low-hanging fruit? Can you execute these first? Drive time to value or shorten time to value. Speed in any large-scale transformation program is always a bit a dubious thing because you cannot transform an organization overnight. That always takes time. It takes a longer-term view with priorities that you need to tackle in a particular sequence. So how do we go then on about this assessment, similar to the slide that I showed a couple of moments ago? First, create the fact-based insights, mine and map processes and or architecture. So depending on the case, some organizations prefer to really keep it SAP-centric and only look at the processes there. Some organizations pull it wider, look at the broader application landscape, and several cases in which I've been engaging mid-market customers, multinational companies, but like mid-market companies, 500 million turnover. We see that when they move from SAP ECC, or when they are thinking about moving from ECC, and they have ECC wall-to-wall SAP. They have the core SAP, they have sales and distribution, they have budgeting and planning, they have forecasting, they have the lot, everything on the SAP stack. Now, in many cases, we see that companies are evaluating more the best of breed solutions. And this is what we discussed in the last webinar, the one that we had last month. What is better, a best of breed or wall-to-wall single vendor? Well, this is an exercise that is being done quite a bit, but it starts with creating that visibility on how do your processes run and where do your different components fit in terms of technology, which processes do they enable, and so forth. So the first step is this: let's use the tools, let's create that visibility, and let's create a platform for us to basically have insightful discussions, but that are fact-based, and then we can evolve from there. In the second step, we look at engaging customers. And this is, of course, we use the fact-based data as an input. We'll have business and IT workshops and focused interviews. And this is where, from a consulting perspective, typically it makes sense to bring in an expert. In our network, in the ICON network, we provide a lot of very senior experts to organizations that run complex transformations. So we have access to very strong people in many different areas, in mining, in manufacturing, in FMCG. And in this engage phase, it's very important that you find an industry expert that has the relevant background for that particular company which you are reviewing, because otherwise you can have the best possible fact-based insights and some recommendations on here are your processes, but the moment that you engage the business, you can actually not have a profound discussion, because I guess all of us in this call probably know that the moment that you put a consultant in front of a user, if they don't speak the same language, if they don't understand each other, and they have the sensing that someone understands their pain, the whole outcome of anything that you do is just not gonna materialize. Now, during that engagement, we create that rapport, we create a deeper understanding, we highlight where the different key working areas are, and based on that, we can then go to a roadmap, prioritize initiatives, sequence action, make recommendations, and so forth. So this is kind of a matrix with which are the low-hanging fruit, which means low cost, short implementation time, which ones are strategic. So start today, run for a long period of time. For instance, creating consistency in terms of how data is used across applications. That could be a strategic initiative, because data consistency is a problem in every single organization. But if you want to have real decent insights or real decent acceleration, for instance, through AI, then it's important, it's absolutely crucial to have a good data set. Because if you accelerate analytics on rubbish data, you just get much faster, you get to a point that you get rubbish outcomes. So it's important. So this can be a strategic initiative that allows you then 1 year later or 2 years later to go and do something. And like this, we kind of look at the entire landscape of process and applications and identify which things you can go and do. Typically, and again, this assessment timeline is indicative, but typically we try to do this in about 8 weeks. Now, when you walk through this, it's the same steps as the ones that I indicated before. A lot of them have, of course, dependencies on the organization that you're working with. For instance, if you look at step 2 here, ERP insights under extraction, that assumes that we have the integration and so forth done already. In some organizations, it has taken us a month or 6 weeks to get the necessary accesses and to create the integration to be able to access the data. And in that case, of course, this timeline is complete rubbish. But if assuming that we can get things done relatively quickly and we get access to the right people and the right stakeholders, then this is a timeline that is achievable. And I'm not going to say that you can do this in Unilever in 8 weeks, but you can do it in a mid-market company that has presence in 5, 6 countries and a relatively moderately complex landscape. It's possible to do this type of discussion or this process in about 8 weeks. So what do we then typically make sure that companies see? Well, of course, the key pain points, and bringing those together after these discussions, it should be very clear what are true pain points and what are kind of a bit of noise. Some indicative or an indication of specific root causes or suspected root causes, and a recommendation on different options on how to approach things. And this then fits within this strategic transformation roadmap. And of course, all the deliverables that have been created during this type of assessment, workshop, tooling outputs, those will be handed over, can be used for future reference, even though, as I mentioned, because organizations and people change, the output is only relevant for a certain period of time. So it may be for the next 6 months to a year, you can really rely on the fact that it's still okay. But after that, it does make sense to evolve and do these things. So either reuse the tooling, do more interviews and so forth, especially when you're going through transformation. It does make sense to measure the impact of the steps that you've taken and see how your organization is evolving. Because it's not because we're working on a transformation that we actually achieve outcomes. And that is something that with regular or continued in assessment points, we can go and measure. As I mentioned in the previous slide, timelines is important. I mean, to maintain a timeline, you need to have some assumptions around that. So key stakeholders and access to the right technology people is going to be very important. And production ERP access is actually required to be able to do this end-to-end process validation. Probably people here in the call will say, why not do this on a quality environment? Now, I've seen plenty of organizations where there's a lot of difference in terms of even configuration between a quality and a production environment. And in a quality environment, you will not have the right amount of relevant data because you don't have the true transactions unless you have done a system copy and so forth. So typically we see it's better to work on a production environment to pull this information out because it will be the most relevant outcomes, the best insights that you get out of a real world environment. Now with Icon, as I mentioned, we have this broad access to different experts in a lot of different fields. So we have this senior advisory access with both industry and implementation experience. If Graham would have been here, between the two of us, we have about 50 years of implementation experience. So we've seen a lot of different things because we've dealt with large organizations, medium-sized organizations, and like that, we have access to scores of additional experts. So that's a very important dimension. We really believe in leading with process, which means using tools to create fact-based insights and then focus on what is happening from a process perspective. So we don't do technology for technology, but we really focus on how will the business be affected by the steps that we are taking. And again, if I look at some of the conversations that we have with companies that are getting ready for a migration, sometimes they don't even necessarily want to change anything because the business process works and they just want to avoid the risk that they will not be supported anymore. But if you do this type of assessment, you can actually identify areas where you can make a business case because most of the time these upgrades are not cheap. And if you then see what you get out of it, it's very difficult to quantify the benefits. And if you do a proper assessment up front, then this is something that you can use in terms of driving a business case and driving real business change and outcomes. So that's basically how we bring these different things together across industries with the right advisory. Now, how do you then typically start? I think anyone that works with larger organizations would be following a similar type of process. We always sign an NDA, and if needed, but in most cases that's needed, and I think it's probably safe to do so if the customer doesn't propose it, but we propose it or you propose it from your end. And then we have a high-level scoping discussion on where do you want to focus on your process, on your architecture, where do you see from a senior management perspective. So this is a discussion of maybe 1 or 2 hours time where you explore a bit on where you think that the core focus should be. And then we have these discussions on the 8 weeks timeline that I presented earlier. does it make sense? Can we achieve this? Or you think we need a month for system accesses and people are too busy, so we need to stretch out the interviews and the workshops and so forth. So timeline, access, these things we then discuss, and then in principle, we can get started.